Good evening. I'm Deborah Nelson, the Dean of the Arts and Humanities, and on behalf of the University of Chicago, welcome to the 2026 Randy L. and Melvin R. Berlin Family Lectures. It is such an honor to be here with you tonight and to welcome Randy Berlin and her family, as well as the University President Paul Alicefados, and of course, our guest speaker, the remarkable writer, Yiyun Li. The Berlin Family Lectures are now in their 12th year and have quickly become a world-class public lecture series for topics in the humanities and the arts. The opportunity to invite thinkers, writers, artists, and other visionaries to our campus, to hear them speak in community with fellow attendees, and then to launch their words into the world and history in a monograph published by the University of Chicago Press, is one of the division's greatest privileges. We remain grateful to the Berlin family for establishing and sustaining this tradition and for all they have done to support the University of Chicago through their thoughtful generosity. Randy, thank you for joining us this evening, and thank you, as ever, for being such a steadfast champion of the arts and humanities. Tonight, we have the great privilege to hear from Yiyun Li, author of a dozen books across multiple genres and the recipient of some of the world's most prestigious writing awards: the PEN/Faulkner Award, the PEN/Jean Stein Award, the International Writer Award from the Royal Society of Literature, the MacArthur Fellowship, and the Wyndham Campbell Prize. She is a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and her most recent work, Things in Nature Merely Grow, won the 2026 Andrew Carnegie Medal and was a finalist for the National Book Award and the PEN/Jean Stein Award. She is currently the Robert F. Goheen Professor in the Humanities at Princeton University, where she teaches creative writing, and she's a member of both the Academy of Arts and Letters and the Academy of Arts and Sciences. Tonight's lecture is entitled 3 Lives, 2 Exiles, 1 Question. Next week, April 7th, will be Precision and Clarity in a Time of Uncertainty. And the concluding lecture on April 14th is Placeholder and Serendipity. All 3 will conclude with an opportunity for the audiences to ask questions and be in dialogue with Yiyun. Let me also note with gratitude that she has graciously offered to sign books after next week's lecture on April 7th. I hope you'll join us for all 3 events. As a scholar of literature, I'm particularly excited to hear her thoughts, for she is not just a writer, but an avid, attentive, analytical reader. As many of you know, last year we changed the name of our division, foregrounding the arts excellence that had long been a vital part of the Division of the Humanities. In our current moment, one of the great strengths of the division is the ability to catalyze exciting new directions of research by celebrating the powerful back and forth dynamic between critical scholarship and creative intelligence. This makes it especially fitting to welcome Yiyun Li, whose work is an exemplary embodiment of both of these elements. In a 2023 piece in The New Yorker, she notes, "I cannot help observing and noticing things even in the most terrible moments." This fidelity to observant noticing, of attending to details, gathering and presenting them to readers, viewers, and audiences, is the purview of artists and scholars alike. In the most difficult times in our professional and collective lives, it's those kinds of interventions that we need above all else: clarity of sight and thought, and the steadfast accretion of meaning. Lee has spoken about the relationship between her writing and her thinking, the ongoing inquiry that undergirds her efforts to make each thought as precise as possible. If you have read her work, you know that she has the capacity to craft sentences that linger in the mind with a complexity of their expression often belied by their initial appearance as straightforward or simple. And if tonight is your introduction to Yiyun Li, I encourage you to seek out her work as swiftly as possible, because you will surely find it transformative. One line of hers that has lingered with me lately is, "Spring always comes, if not now, later." That's particularly apt for Chicago. It feels appropriate to our current moment in so many ways. While her career as an author has been flourishing for more than 2 decades, she started out as a student of science studying immunology. And so it is fitting that she be introduced by one of UChicago's premier scientists, University President Paul Alicevados. Paul has led the university for nearly 5 years and was recently re-elected to another 5-year term. He is also a Chicago-born alumnus of this university, earning his undergraduate degree here in chemistry. He went on to earn his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, where he later held several leadership positions, including director of the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory under President Obama. Here at Chicago, he's the John D. MacArthur Distinguished Service Professor, chairs the Board of Governors for Argonne National Laboratory, and chairs the group that oversees Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory. In addition to these roles, Paul has earned international recognition for his expertise in nanochemistry. You might even say that just like artists and humanist scholars, he too is adept at noticing the small details. I cannot pretend to comprehend the intricacies of Paul's research, but I do know that he is widely acknowledged as having transformed his field by identifying new properties of nanocrystals. His research has led to more than 50 patents and has real-world applications ranging from biomedicine to digital screen displays to renewable energy. He has been honored for his work with more than 24 awards, which I will not list, but you may recognize a few: the Wolf Prize, the Dan Prize, the National Academy of Science Award in Chemical Sciences. He is also, like Yiyun Li, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. As president of UChicago, Paul has voiced his commitment to maintaining our institution's intellectual rigor, joy in discovery and new ideas, and fierce commitment to fierce free speech and vigorous debate, values that are especially important to humanistic scholarship and creative endeavors of the students and faculty in the Division of the Arts and Humanities. It is my pleasure to have him here with us tonight, so please join me in welcoming Paul Alicevados.
Thank you, Debbie. It was too much about me, but thank you so much for being here tonight. This is a very special occasion. Always, Randy Berlin. I'm looking at you and thinking how grateful we are that you're able to come here and to be with us. Your family has gifted us a very special gift here. Each year, we bring somebody who really challenges us to think more deeply and honors our culture by asking us to recommit to close work, to careful reading, to careful construction of ideas, to doing that with great integrity and seriousness. I know, John and Sharon, you've come along, John, from the Berlin family, Randy's son. Thank you both for coming and for bringing Randy to be with us. It means a lot to us that you're here, and it really creates for us a great sense of community. So it's wonderful that you could be here. And Dean Nelson spoke quite powerfully about the works of Yiyun Li, and when I saw that this was coming up, I did decide to listen. I listen to audiobooks as much as I read, and so in this case, I did listen to Book of Goose, and it's an extraordinary work. Thank you. And I experienced the power also of your most recent book, which is an extraordinary one, very, very difficult and important set of topics that you have engaged, and I want to acknowledge what Debbie mentioned a moment ago, which is the precision, clarity of language and thought. It's absolutely extraordinary, and it is quite beautiful, even as it can be very hard. So I think those things exemplify our values here in extraordinary ways. So I'm very grateful that you've come to spend 3 days with us, 3 lectures with us, hopefully many more days. And please know that you're very welcome here as a scholar at the University of Chicago. Thank you all.
Thank you, President Alcevatos, and thank you, Dean Nelson, for your warm welcome and this beautiful introduction. It's a great honor to be here. I would like to thank the Berlin family for founding the lecture series, a much needed support for arts and humanities, especially at a time when things we have treasured are constantly under attack from different sides. Thank you, Randy, for being here. I would also like to thank Alan Thomas for many conversations over the past few years about the lectures. And thank you to Mark Temelko, Rivki Mondel, Al Kovari, and Sarah Zimmerman for taking care of me. Some time ago, I agreed to give the Berlin family lectures and proposed a series titled Placeholder. In the introduction, I quoted myself from an essay published in The New Yorker on gardening after the death of our older son, Vincent. A rose is never an argument. There's no such thing as an angry rose or a moping rose or an empowered rose. Only a realistic rose, a matter-of-fact rose, a transient rose. Each flower in my garden holds some concrete space, a physical one as well as a temporal one. A flower, like a thought, a sentence, a book, is but a placeholder. I just would like to show you some of the roses from my garden last year. These beautiful, transient, realistic roses. I think these are Carding Mills, Emily Bronte, and Vanessa Bell. The description for the 3 lectures were finalized on January 31st, 2024. And the lectures were to be delivered that spring. 16 days later, our younger son James died from suicide, 6 years and 5 months after his older brother died from suicide. I have written about these events in a book called Things in Nature Merely Grow, so I won't go into the details. I had to cancel the lectures in 2024. I was honored and touched that this invitation had been reissued, that I get to stand here to share a few things about my thoughts on placeholder. In fact, my thoughts have come a long way since my proposal in 2024. The world has come a long way too. I have scrapped my original talks, hoping to be more mindful of what has happened in the past few years, and in the past few months, and even in the past few days, in the world, in higher education, and in my own life. This new series will be titled Placeholder and Serendipity. Over the 3 lectures, I would like to investigate 2 concepts that are central to my approach to reading, writing, and teaching, placeholder and serendipity. During a contentious time when humanistic values often feel besieged, and life is increasingly driven by quests and outcomes, I would like to tell you a few stories, think through with you a few questions, and have a conversation with kindred spirits. So the first lecture today, 3 lives, 2 exiles, 1 question. The first life of the lecture is someone you all know, Madame Curie. When I was 12, I was given a copy of Madame Curie's biography as a present. This was the original cover of the Chinese translation, published in 1978. In the next 2 years, I read the biography many times with a red-blue pencil. For those of you who remember the old days, the red-blue pencils were also known as editing pencils, which offered me an unusually flattering sense of maturity. I underlined the biography with either red or blue, one color for how to study and work for science, the other for the scientific knowledge in the biography. I was considered a promising young mathematician then. My career plan was to become a physicist like my father, and my aspiration was to be the Madame Curie of China. What I did not know then was that I was reading Madame Curie's biography not as an instruction manual on how to become a leading scientist, but how to live. I recently reread the biography, and many of the details are like dormant seeds in my memory, ready to germinate again. Madame Curie's life story may be familiar to many of you, so I will briefly summarize it here. Born in Poland in 1867, Marie was one of the 6 children in the family, and her parents were school teachers. She went to Paris at 24 to pursue a degree in physics and endured poverty and solitude. 3 years later, she met Pierre Curie, whose genius was akin to hers. They had a happy marriage, 2 children, and shared a Nobel Prize in physics in 1903 for the discovery of radioactivity. Here are photos, 2 photos from the biography. Those are Marie and Pierre on their honeymoon, riding bicycles around in France. And the other one is the lab, which was really no more than a shed, where the couple discovered radioactivity. On an April day in 1906, Pierre Curie, whose mind seemed to be always preoccupied with science, stepped in front of a horse carriage and was run over by accident, his head crushed by the wheel. That year, Pierre was 46, Marie 38. The University of Paris, where Pierre had held a chair in science, decided to confer the chair on Marie, the first time such a position was granted to a woman in French higher education. When consulted on the decision, Marie answered simply, "I will try." In November 1906, Madame Curie was set to deliver a lecture, the first time a female professor would do so in France. There was an outcry in the press that the university had not moved the lecture to an amphitheater so as to allow enough space for spectators. There were 120 seats in the lecture hall. An hour and a half before the lecture, reporters, society women, artists, general public swarmed to the hall as though it were a theater opening. None of them would have cared about the topics of the lecture, theory of ions in gases. Paul, you would care about that. Yes. When I was a child, I reread the entry of Madame Curie on the day until I could see everything with my eyes. There was a vivid agitation in the hall, as all the people were wondering how the celebrated widow would eulogize the predecessor of her position and talk about Pierre in public. Madame Curie quickly silenced the applauding crowd with a stern and dry gesture and went straight to this opening. When one considers the progress that has been made in physics in the past 10 years, without a word about her husband, her life, her widowhood, and without satisfying any spectator's thirst for drama and melodrama, she resumed the teaching with the precise sentence where Pierre Curie had left it. Alas, I gave up a career in science, so I will never realize my childhood dream of becoming Madame Curie. And unlike her, I do not have the luxury of going into the heart of a scientific matter directly in lecture. I have to acknowledge that my life experience, coming to the United States to study science at 23, around the same age, Madame Curie left the home country, switching to a new career and choosing a new language to write, and living with sorrowful losses midway upon the journey of my life. All these are pertinent to my lectures. Though, like Madame Curie, I may disappoint anyone with a burning curiosity. In thinking through the questions in these lectures, my plan is to study other lives, with my attention directed outward instead of at myself. I must also preface that I approach these lectures not as a scholar. I have no formal training in any branches of scholastic studies other than medical science. I think of myself as a self-taught writer, having learned writing mostly from reading, and having read without any system or theory. In reading and writing, I consider myself a wanderer, equipped with instinct, a tolerance for uncertainty, and some old-fashioned maps rather than a GPS system. In my life, in every endeavor, I often go back to Madame Curie's words that I learned as a child. I will try. The second life for this lecture is a Chinese author named Shen Congwen. Here's a picture of him and his wife, Zhang Zhaohe. I first discovered Shen Congwen in college in the early 90s, when his work had begun to be reissued in China. Some of you may be familiar with his work and his life, and for those of you who are interested, there are some great translations by Jeffrey Kinkley, with whom I had some moving exchange of correspondence, which I'll talk about in the last lecture. Shen Congwen was born in 1902 in Phoenix, a small town in West Hunan province. He left school at 14 and joined the army. His stories started to appear in a magazine in 1925, and over the next 20 years, he published widely stories, novels, essays. Many of them, I believe, are among the best work of the 20th century written in Chinese. Like Chekhov, his favorite writer, Shen approached his fiction with a humane understanding that stood out as apolitical at a time when politics and class struggles took center stage in Chinese literature. His characters are riverside prostitutes patronized by passing boatmen, a mother and a daughter eking out a living in a mill, an old man in charge of a ferry bringing up a granddaughter born out of wedlock, and many others, peasants, soldiers, fishermen, landlords, army officers, little people caught by the vast history. Shen's stance of being apolitical exposed him to harsh criticism from his fellow writers on the progressive left. This question of relevance has been on my mind for my entire career. Relevance, to be timely, to be engaged with the right themes from the right angles, is a useful tool for lesser minds to attack true artists. Being relevant, unfortunately, is a perennial standard for writers to be judged. In the same camp of writers insisting on being irrelevant, I would also include one of my favorite, Turgenev. I may even put myself in this camp. In 1949, when the Communist Party was about to take over China, Shan foresaw a nation that would have no use for his writing. After 2 failed suicide attempts, he gave up writing fiction and took a research position in a history museum. Later, during the Cultural Revolution, he was demoted to a toilet cleaner. His experience during those years was not much different from that of other artists and intellectuals of his generation. In 1966, Lao She, another literary master of the 20th century, drowned himself after being beaten by the Red Guards. The same year, Fouillé, the translator of Balzac, Romain Rolland, and other French writers, swallowed poison in his apartment. And 2 hours later, after making sure he was dead, his wife hanged herself. What makes Shan's case unique, at least to me, is that he had chosen to end his writing career. Many of his peers tried very hard to adapt their artistic pursuits to the new communist standards. Some succeeded, many suffered. Shan, on the other hand, exiled himself from literature. He did not write anything literary for publication for the next 30+ years. However, there is a selection of his letters, family letters of Shan Congwen, which his wife selected and edited for publication in 1995. The book begins with their courtship and covers a marriage that lasted for over 50 years. When I left China in 1996, it was among the few Chinese books I brought with me to the US. Some time ago, I translated a selection of his letters into English and published them in a literary magazine, A Public Space, under the title, Shan Congwen, an Irrelevant Writer. Shan died in 1988, never having broken his silence as a fiction writer. In the 40 years of his life in communist China, he published a few scholarly work on the Asian costumes and artifacts. Oh, wow, the rain. Sorry to be distracted. It was those written books that have driven me to read and reread his letters, as if they could offer some small compensation for a great loss. When I translated the letters, I could often sense that storyteller's mind, describing places, people, sounds, colors, in letters to be read by only one reader. Recently, I read his scholarly work, a book called The Research on Ancient Chinese Apparel, which was published in 1981. The research was expensive, starting from the sewing tools in the Paleolithic age and ending with Qing Dynasty fabrics. What moved me was that in the introduction to the work, Shan mentioned his ex-career as a fiction writer. This research, he wrote, is similar to my creative work in the first half of my life. It's an understanding from my personal angle, and the work has the scope of a novel, and each chapter reads more like a narrative. I was quite touched when I read the introduction. Shan was a fiction writer and retained his narrative instinct through his self-exile from literature. In my career, I've often felt a kinship to his stance. His insistence on being irrelevant was itself a protest and a rebellion. One could view his life as a tragedy, but tragedy, I often believe, is a term people use wantonly because they're not part of it. While people who use tragedies freely about their own lives, it seems to me, are on the cusp of becoming comedians. The third life of the lecture needs a longer introduction, so please bear with me. Some years ago, I was at an academic dinner welcoming young faculty members to a university. Next to me was an assistant professor in classics. In the course of the conversation, I told the other professor that when I first arrived in America, in order to improve my English, I studied French and Latin with a tutor. I didn't know how I came up with the idea, but it turned out to be an influential experience. To study French and Latin with textbooks written in English automatically placed English as the root language for my brain. The woman who taught me those two languages was in her late 60s. She came from a seafaring family and hailed from Eastern Europe, and she spoke 14 languages. This was in the late 1990s in Iowa City, Iowa. And the woman, whose day job was to compile lists of weddings and obituaries for the local newspaper, would twice a week reserve a study room in the public library and meet me, 1 hour for Latin and 1 hour for French. She was a demanding teacher. I lived on a graduate stipend of $15,000 a year and was not otherwise allowed to work, so she charged me a nominal fee. I studied with her for 2 years, and the only time I asked to be excused from a lesson was on the day my husband and I got married in the courthouse. I did not tell her the reason for my absence until the following week. She said it would be her job to file my marriage for the Iowa City Press Citizen, which she did, as I recently saw the record of the newspaper archive, a list of marriages, births, and deaths in October 1998. Around the same time, I'd been told by my PhD advisor that one of his classmates in grad school, a scientist from Japan, read children's books to improve her English. I thought now that I was learning French and Latin, I should give that a try. There were plenty of French books for children, but there was only one in Latin. One day, while waiting for my teacher, I started to read the Latin book. Puzzling over the words and grammar, I was able to get a fair sense that on the first page, a little boy is walking downstairs with a stuffed bear, whose head was thumping on every step. Then my teacher arrived. I showed her the book and said that I was able to figure out the first paragraph. She looked at me strangely and asked me if I had known the book. No, I replied. She then asked me if I had heard of Winnie the Pooh. And my answer to that was still no. She marveled and took me to the children's book section and handed a copy to me. The first paragraph was precisely what I had figured out in Latin. Here's Edward Bear coming downstairs now, bump, 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 so on and so forth. And anyhow, here he is at the bottom and ready to be introduced to you, Winnie the Pooh. I was 25, newly married, when I first met Winnie the Pooh, not in English, but in a Latin translation titled Winnie the Pooh. This is the first edition. I just adore the cover. I think it's just a beautiful, funny cover. Yes, the translator, I will get on to him. So back to the academic dinner. I told the classic scholar that I studied Latin with a tutor and read the Latin translation of Winnie the Pooh. He was amused, but he was also full of disapproval. You may not be aware that the Latin translation of that book wasn't considered elegant at all, he said. Then asked me, why did your teacher let you read that instead of Cicero? Why was I reading a world-famous children's book without knowing what it was? in the Latin translation that did not sound like Cicero? Why was I dreaming of becoming a writer in English when many people I met when I first arrived in America spoke to me slowly as though I was a child? Why write when there has been a perennial alarm going on about people no longer reading in our time? Why read at all when literature itself seems to be going out of fashion, though such an alarm must have been sounded for every generation? Sometimes I think the answer to all these why questions is simply, why not? Things we love don't have to make sense to the wider world, so long as they make sense to ourselves. Justification for what matters most to ourselves sometimes feels as though it were the starting point of defeat. So, if you or me, hearing the complaints from a scholar about an inelegant translation, you might also ask the question I did. Who was this translator who would translate the beloved children's book into Latin? Why Winnie the Pooh? Why Latin? Alexandra Leonard, this is the third life of tonight, was born in a Jewish family in Budapest in 1910. Unsettled by the Great War, the family moved to Vienna, where Leonard pursued a medical degree. In 1938, Dr. Leonard fled to Rome. In his own words about this flight to Italy, the words are taken from his memoir, I made the acquaintance of suffering at the same time that I learned to know Michelangelo. I witnessed for the first time the Colosseum and the vast indifference of my contemporaries. One thing I knew, however, the dictators enslaved their victims with chains of paper. I inscribed my name on no list and in no registry of tenants, took my expired passports to no consulate, and if I ate very little, and I ate the bread without a bread ration card. That's from his memoir. To support himself, Dr. Leonard made a living teaching English, but the only English book he had was a children's book, Winnie the Pooh, which became his only textbook for his Italian students. One of his students was the leader of the Venetian resistance, who needed to learn English to negotiate with the Allies. After some months of studying Winnie the Pooh with Dr. Leonard, Pier Ferrero met the English staff, who complimented him on his English, and he parachuted back into Venice with a supply for the resistance to sabotage the retreat of German troops. After the Allies took over Italy, Dr. Leonard worked first for the US Psychological Warfare Branch, then became the doctor for the United States Claims Service. After 1948, he became the chief anthropologist in the United States Graves Registration Service. In his own words, washing, measuring, and cementing the bones of American dead. In the early 1950s, a Hungarian university invited Dr. Leonard to return to the mother country and serve as the department chair of the history of medicine. Foreseeing his inability to be a good communist, Dr. Leonard turned down the invitation. He also declined an invitation from his most recent employer, the United States, as the country was already involved in the Korean War, and the Army particularly was interested in retaining his service in Korea. Instead, he looked at the map and found a country that looks big and green on the map. He asked for a one-way ticket to sail to Brazil, the end of the world. In so many ways it felt to his European peers. Once he arrived in Brazil, he did not stay in any metropolis, but traveled inland until he reached the valley of Dana Irma, truly the end of the world, even to many Brazilians. There, he purchased a small apothecary's business, worked as a doctor for the miners of the local lead mines, many of them dying of lead poisoning. There, he also educated the children again with the book, Winnie the Pooh. Dr. Leonard lived in the valley of Dana Irma for the rest of his life and died in 1972. During the 20 years of his residence in what he called the Happy Valley, he traveled and talked to the local people, wrote and drew, and somehow came up with this brilliant idea of translating Winnie the Pooh, one of the most important books for him, into Latin. He self-published the book and printed 1,500 copies in 1958. But the book became so successful that it spent 20 weeks on the best-selling list of the New York Times, the first time a translated work had gained such an honor. One might, if one is a classic professor, one might raise one's eyebrow and say, so, what if he translated a children's book into Latin? Or someone else may be saying, so, what? Latin is already a dead language, and Winnie the Pooh, first published in 1926, is already 100 years old. Dr. Leonard's decision not to remain in Europe, not in Venice or Rome, or returning to Budapest, and his decision to turn down America, even though he had relatives in America, there was resolution in this self-exile. But it was not one made as a sacrifice, a protest, or a concession. In his memoir titled The Valley of the Latin Bear, Dr. Leonard has a refrain of traveling further and further to the end of the world. But even at the end of the world, there were still trains, horse buggies, human dramas. And it was at the end of the world where he settled down. Sometimes what we perceive as necessities are simply options. A perch in Rome and a perch in the valley of Dana Irma. What difference did it make when his goal was to have an independence as much as possible in a chaotic world, and plenty of time to enjoy music, languages, drawings, words, and his favorite book, Winnie the Pooh. So these three lives, Marie Curie, Shenton Wen, and Alexander Leonard, have been on my mind for some time. When I look at my life and my career trajectory, I recognize the indelible influence each has had on me. Though Madame Curie seemed to have a better life than the other two, as a scientist with accolades, she not only suffered an early loss of a spouse, but also had to face public scrutiny of her personal life. So here's the part you may not know, and that I have withheld until now. After her husband's death, Madame Curie had a romantic relationship with the physicist Paul Langevin, who was a married man. When the affair was discovered, there was an outcry in France, full of sentiments of misogyny and xenophobia against Madame Curie. Parisian mobs gathered in front of her house, forcing her to go into hiding with her daughters. When she won the second Nobel Prize, the Nobel Prize Committee advised her against appearing in Stockholm for fear of scandals. Against the official wish, Madame Curie showed up for her own honor. 3 lives, 2 of them were immigrants. 2 of them chose to exile themselves. One from his home continent, the other from his lifelong love of writing fiction. One thing that all 3 of them share, which had been on my mind often these days, is how they, in each of their own ways, established and maintain some kind of space, inside of which they could, first and foremost, be themselves. For Madame Curie, it's her dedication to science. For Shen Congwen, his stubborn silence. And for Dr. Leonard, his life at the end of the world, his love of languages and human stories. Never, I imagine, at any time of their lives, did they spare a moment of their lives to do something called seeming. A note here about being and seeming. I've noticed my students are very fond of the verb seem. A character seems pensive. Another character seems to be enjoying his dinner. So I often give them the line from Hamlet. You know the line, when Hamlet is confronted by his mother, who accuses him for seeming, particularly in his sorrow. Hamlet said, "Seems, madam, no, it is, nay, it is, I know no seems." And in teaching literature, I ask my students to pay attention to the contrast between seeming and being. And a few weeks ago, now this is very naughty, this was extremely naughty of me as a professor, because I was trying to teach them seeming and being. So I came in one day and I asked the class, there were 33 students in my class, 33 that day. I asked them if they thought they had been admitted to Princeton by seeming or being. There was this nervous tittering. And a student said, seeming. So I asked, how many of you got to Princeton by seeming? Oh, but one student raised their hands. So I said to the girl, I said, did you get to Princeton by being yourself? The student thought for a moment and said, well, actually, by seeming. But I hope I have done a good job of seeming to be myself. My decision to start this lecture series with these three lives is partly out of my admiration for their life and work, and partly, I think, is that I have found courage for my own life from their stories. I've made a similar decision to have exiled myself from my mother tongue. The public outcry against my decision and the public scrutiny of my private life, unlike Madame Curie, are not from my adopted country, but often from my mother country. I have maintained a certain kind of silence, as Shen Congwen did. And most important of all, I've always found joy in words, as Dr. Leonard did. If the flowers hold some, so now I can show you the flowers. These are my garden pictures from last year. If the flowers in my garden hold some concrete space, a physical one as well as a temporal one, literature too holds the space that is forever bound to time and space, and sometimes confined by time and space. Please allow me to quote my gardening essay from the New Yorker. One early morning, I looked out the window and saw 2 deer and a rabbit in my front garden, eating up some hydrangea bushes I had planted a few weeks earlier. It occurred to me that had I been able to go back to my childhood self and tell her that one day I would live in a place where rabbits and deer eat side by side, peacefully, the child would be incredulous. Certainly no real people could live in a fairy tale like that. I'm sure that if you had been told when you were a child about all the things that you were going to have to do, you would have thought that you had better die at once. You would not have believed you could ever have the strength to do them. This is Rebecca West's trilogy. In Rebecca West's trilogy, Richard Quinn says to his mother before he leaves to be killed in France, had I been able to go back to my childhood self and tell her that one day I would live as a mother who has lost a son, the child would be equally incredulous. Surely such things happen only in fiction, to characters who are much more interesting and tragic. The essay was written in the summer of 2023, when my garden was at its prime, and appeared in a magazine in October 2023, when leaves began to fall. In 4 months, James would die. But when I was writing that essay, I did not yet know that life could bring more incredulous events. A natural question after the losses is this: how does one go on? And it is not merely my personal life. If we look at what's going on in the world, I wonder how many of us have experienced the misgivings that Dr. Leonard and Shen Zongwen experienced in their time. A question has been on my mind for some time. How do we stay enchanted with this disenchanting and perhaps disenchanted world? In the next 2 lectures, I hope to have a few more stories and a few more thoughts to share, and to pass us through this question, which may not be easily answerable. There's the 2 lectures, next 2 lectures. Finally, this is the moment I'm waiting for. For those of you who garden, I present one of the most enchanting anniversaries of my life. Bear with me. I think he's having fun there, and I would like you to applaud my rabbit.
So I hope that we quickly get to your questions, but it's my responsibility to ask the first one, and this is maybe one of the hardest first questions, like how do I not sound completely banal after a lecture like that? So I want to ask you a question. All of these 3 lives, people either hurl themselves into the unknown or find themselves there. Madame Curie finds herself there more so than the other 2, right? And on the other side, you have a kind of story of fixity and certainty. So I know uncertainty is a big part of this, so you don't necessarily have to talk about that. But this seems like a really important space for you to tolerate or to even embrace. And can you talk about that in terms of writing? What does writing allow? So I also have to say I'm somewhat thinking of Vagrants, where having lived myself in China, right as the door was opening, it's kind of the bludgeoning certainty of this framework that people live in, that they try to eke out some kind of life from there. So these things all feel like they go together, both sort of just the biographical, the political. How do you find that and tolerate that space? Or what does uncertainty give to you that obviously seems like a release from something that is painful too?
Uncertainty. You want
uncertainty,
yeah. Sometimes I think uncertainty may be one of the most difficult things for all the people.
I agree.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I feel like I sometimes look at my dog and think he's very lucky. He doesn't understand uncertainty. He's an old dog now. So at 5 o'clock, he just stands there. He's blind. He knows I'm going to feed him. Mm-hmm. There's food. There's love. There's everything he needs. But as human beings, we have so much. We have a lot of advantages, but we don't have certainty. Mm-hmm. And I think uncertainty seems to me a most universal situation.
Right.
Whether you're from, a posh family or a poor family, mm-hmm. uncertainty is the same, and it works on our psychology the same way. And so I think it's certain, like it's certainly, I shouldn't use certainly, it's certainly one of the topics I've thought all the time. How do we tolerate uncertainty? And going back to that, I do consider myself as a writer, an old-fashioned writer. I don't have a GPS. I think the technology also increases our illusion of certainty.
Right, interesting, yeah.
If you have a GPS, you think you will get there by that time. All these, no, you won't. Well, you may, but you may not. So,
Right.
so I think, contemporary life technology and we have this illusion of certainty. But I think in writing, I would like to say I don't have a GPS. I don't know where I am going, but I know I can get somewhere if I keep working, if I just put one word there, another word, if I put words into sentences into paragraphs, I may be able to get somewhere. So that's the only way to tolerate uncertainty. And in fact, I think if you have a GPS when you write, or even if you have a GPS when you read, it's becoming less interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So there are satisfactions too. Right?
Yes.
That the uncertainty is also pleasure, maybe too strong a word, but of discovery.
Discovery.
Yeah.
I didn't know I was going to meet Winnie the Pooh in Latin. And I didn't know I was going to meet Dr. Leonard in his book. These came, if I was very certain about my life, I would just have been doing bench work in my lab.
Yeah, yeah.
And I would miss all these opportunities.
Right.
So I think to keep one's mind open and to think maybe you will see something if you just tolerate that uncertainty.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It's really difficult. Do we have questions? Yes, I see a question right in the middle here, in the back. I know getting you a microphone is going to be a task, but we can do it. We have the technology.
Thank you so much for this beautiful lecture. I was just really struck by the two examples that you gave. I think growing up, especially in China, there's this specific figures like Shen Congwen and like Madame Curie as this kind of imagined standard of exemplary life, something that you're always measured against, even though sometimes they don't quite exist. And I wonder how you think this internalized ideal shapes the way we remember our own lives, especially when our own experiences don't seem to match that sense of quote unquote enough. And I recently listened to this interview with the Chinese writer Yan Geling, and she mentioned how the unstable nature of memory becomes, for her, the cornerstone of her practice. And I wonder, does that, does one's life begin to reorganize itself around the gap from, the relationship that we have with those exemplary figures that we look up to growing up? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I do think it's a very interesting question because Madame Curie is an inspiring figure. She has done all these things to give space to all of us following her. I think when I was a child, I thought of her as an exemplary figure. But I think as one grows up or as one knows life better, she's just one woman. She's a woman who has lived and worked and done things, and she's not a saint. And I don't think I would not put her into that status as though I have to measure my life against hers. In fact, I think you said something very interesting, is this urge to measure our lives against something, against someone. Now that's, if you think about social media, all the anxiety from social media comes from measuring your life with the person next to you. Why are you in Europe while I'm sitting here? Or why are you having this beautiful, dress while I'm in jeans? I think this measuring, it is like innate sort of, I don't know, I think maybe parents put that in the children's heads, but we also do grow up with this. People will say, look at that person, he's doing that, why don't you do that? This comparing, and I think it's measuring. I think your wording is very good, measuring, right? The moment you measure, the next thing is to judge. And that's one, it's extremely harmful, and it's not very, very healthy, right? So I think my answer is, you just probably don't do that, which is not helpful because we all do that. Yeah. So your second part is, how do you do that? Do you go back, work on your memory? I have a different view of that. I don't look back. I look forward, because I think, I do look back. When we write fiction, especially, oftentimes we do investigate memory. But the back is set. And what you can have is just different interpretation. You can interpret differently, but the past is there. The future is interesting, going back to what you said, uncertainty. The only thing we have about the future is uncertainty. And that's one thing that I think it's worth trying to live for that, rather than to go back to revisit memory or to reshape the memory. So I guess my answer is, well, face forward. Look at all the uncertainty. There's no point comparing you with Madame Curie or anyone, because I'm sure Madame Curie was also full of uncertainties in her life. But I think she had, knowing her life well, I think she had one certainty, was her work. And Dr. Leonard had one certainty, was his love of words. So I think in this uncertain time, you have something that it's certain, it's yours, and that would allow yourself to be rather than to seem, right? So the to seem is all about comparing, judging, and measuring. Yeah. Yes. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you for a fabulous lecture. You made this point that you left the bench, and it gave you so many new things to do, so many experiences. And I wonder a little bit about the connection to the science and the humanities, that your experience with science, in the first part of your life, inform your approach to writing, or the writing itself?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good question. Sometimes, being in academia, sometimes there's this, animosity between science and arts. Sometimes I've heard in my institute, people talk about that. I am very pro-science because I love science. I left science not because I did not like science or bench work. I really did love bench work, but I just wanted to try something new. So I have brought a lot of things from science into writing. The most important thing, of course, is work ethic. When you're a scientist, you go to your lab every day, you do bench work. If something doesn't work, you do it again. If something works out, you have to repeat 3 more times, right? So it's never, I don't think you can just sit there and say, I don't have inspiration today to do science. And the same way, I don't think one should say, I don't feel inspired to write today, or I don't have any words. I think the thing is to put yourself into that position. You have to work. So I have the work ethics of a scientist as a writer, and I don't think that's quite usual, because I've known a lot of writers. I don't mean to brag, but I do feel
No writers here, not a one.
I do feel that I do work every day and do it in a dedicated way. The second thing I think it's important is, in science, we never say we know something. In science, we said we hypothesis. We have a hypothesis. We're going to test it, whether it's wrong or not. But either it's right or wrong, but you still have to go one step forward. So you're only knowing one thing at a time. You can never know the truth. You can never know anything 100%. And for me, that's the same as writing fiction. And I always say you cannot know your characters 100%, because if you know someone 100%, it's a dead character. It's a flat character. So just to keep that unknowable in mind, it's always an approximation of knowing something better, knowing something more, getting closer. So I think I carried that from science. And one more thing, I love that you said the precision. And I think scientists really, my science career really has taught me to be precise is important. You cannot, I mean, in science, you really cannot do seeming, right? That gets you nowhere. So I have brought a lot of my scientific experience into writing. And in fact, I think I would credit my science background for many of the things I've done. Yeah, I hope I answered your question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. And I wanted to ask you about what you think about writing in English as, I think, your second language. And maybe whether that connects to the topic of exile that you talked about today. I was reading your book, Dear Friend, yesterday, in which you described English as an adopted language, which I thought was a very fascinating phrase. And personally, I also grew up in China, and today I sometimes feel that when writing in Chinese, which is my mother language, a lot of words carry loads of connotations or memories. And I wonder if you've had any experience with that.
Right. Yes. Thank you. That's a very good question, and I also feel that I have written extensively about this topic of writing in an adopted language, and I mean the short answer is I'd never written anything in Chinese creatively. So I was educated in China until college, after college, but I was educated as a scientist. So, and I think my decision to write happened when I took English as my language. So which really means English is becoming my first language in writing. I still do my math in Chinese. I think that you have to do it in your mother tongue. Yeah. But other than math and counting, I live in English as a choice. That's my choice. And I know there are a lot of sort of pressure from China, thinking this is a kind of betrayal. And I feel that's the kind of thing that Madame Curie would face, because she's a woman and she's an immigrant, so the French did not like her. And I think oftentimes when these decisions are personal decisions, private decisions, and people would take private decisions and make a big ado about it, right? So, and which is why I talk about Chen Congwen. I think the fact that he chose silence is a very strong statement. And I always think that statement is very close to my heart. It's Marianne Moore's line, the deepest feelings express itself in silence, not silence, but restraint. Yeah.
So can I ask you just an informational question? So if your work is translated in Chinese, do you then look at it and say, no, that's not working?
Very good question. So for many years, I declined Chinese translation for various reasons. And so my the Book of Goose was about French, about France. So I thought, now that's France. So let's try we can translate that. So I did a test run with the Book of Goose and Must I Go as another novel set in America about American women. And I did not read the translation because I was very afraid. My books have been translated into more than 20 languages, and I don't read most of the languages. I mean, I don't read any of them, sorry, to be precise.
They didn't translate you into Latin.
Yes, not yet, not Latin. But I think to be fair, I shouldn't read the Chinese translation because I want to respect the translator. I want to respect that's their work, their art, artistic creation. So I did not read them.
Yes.
So on the certainty question, Bertrand Russell had felt or stated that certainty was one of the best ways we might evaluate our knowledge and formation of knowledge. A simple item like whether the sun will rise tomorrow being something that many people would consider themselves to be quite certain in, but then doubt can arise. I'm curious how, moving from the sciences to the arts, that question as well, you consider the formation of knowledge now for yourself and also for your students, because if I think about the artistic domain, we have intuition that comes in quite a bit, and then spontaneity, on which we can say whether we identify with something that someone is saying to us, whether we feel socially that we know whether what they are saying is something we can assimilate to concepts we already know. But in the sciences, like with Curie, we have quite a directed case where we know what it is that we want to know, and whether we're getting closer to it or not comes on a sort of day-by-day process, as you had pointed out, sort of a disciplinarian approach. I'm curious how you consider that role of intuition, which is always there for both sides, and this knowledge question as a much more, let's say, broad concept across both disciplines.
Right. I do think intuition, I mean, a scientist, a good scientist has good intuition too, and must have good intuition to know where, the research goes, right? But you always try. And intuition is interesting because intuition seems to me to be in between certainty and uncertainty.
Yeah.
If you are certain about something, that's no longer intuition, right? You cannot call it intuition. If I know the sun is coming up tomorrow, that probably is a fact that we all share. It's a knowledge. But intuition is also not uncertainty.
No.
Yeah.
But you still have to hurl yourself into it.
Yes.
Like you have to say, well, I mean, I'm just speaking for myself. You think you have an idea.
You have to
You're not really sure the idea works.
Yes.
You're not even sure that's the idea you're going to
Yeah.
end up with, but you have to just say, okay, I choose it, and I'm going to keep going. And,
Yeah.
and you're not guaranteed anything, and it might be crap, and you might
Right.
have to move on. So.
Well, that goes back to Madame Curie's words, I will try.
Yeah.
She never said she would succeed or she would do something. All her life, she was just trying. And I think I consider myself one of the triers rather than, doers. I cannot say I will be able to do this, but I can always say I will try. And if I fail, that's okay. And I'll just try again, try better. So I think, going back, I do think the uncertainty is a major sort of theme of my thinking is the fact that you can try and try again sort of alleviate the pain of feeling uncertain, right? So if you feel uncertain about your work, I think we writers all do this. We just face the screen and say, no, what's going to happen to my career? Am I having a career? Are they going to just stop publishing? All these anxieties, uncertainty. The only thing that alleviates the pains of that is just to start typing, start writing the sentences. So I try to teach my students that. I think it is one of the things that are not very easy to teach younger generation. I think for many reasons. One is I do think they grew up with technology. Everything is certain, right? So if you say anything, they can find an answer right away on the internet. They give you the answer. They sort of lose the joy of wandering around and bumping around and seeing things that they have never expected to see. So I try to explain that to my students. I think some of them may have this experience. Many of them are still learning, and they're still young. And so our hope is they will, learn at some point. Yeah.
Okay. Last question. Ooh, who's it going to be? Right down in the middle. Here you go.
Thank you so much for framing these three exiled placeholders who are inspiration for you and newfound inspiration for me. And I consider you also to be a placeholder of inspiration. So I was wondering if you could speak to the, each one has a distinct kind of boundary for their exile or abyss. Could you speak to your criteria for your boundary of your abyss? And that could be in your creative work, for example, in Things in Nature, you've said that you cannot write these things into fiction, and it does seem that, in the more recent New Yorker pieces, that it is coming to life as fiction, or not, or yes.
Right, that's a very good question. Well, yes, I think I use the word abyss quite a bit, right? Because that's how I look at my life. And I think this is always interesting. When you lose someone, people just sort of feel that, when are you going to stop grieving? Which means, when are you going to become one of us, normal people? And the answer is never. It's never. And so I frame my life as an abyss. And I'm not eager to get out because there's no way out. What I can do, talking about certainty, is this is one certainty I have with my life, is I'm going to be in this abyss. But I can do things here rather than spending all my life trying to climb out of this place. I'm not. So that's sort of my, you said the boundary of my work. And oftentimes I feel, there are certain things I'm not going to write in fiction, and I always prove myself wrong. Which means I sort of felt Things in Nature merely grow, when I finished the book, I thought I'm done with this topic. But now I realize sometimes writing nonfiction is only, speaking of placeholder, right, making space. I think my nonfiction, I don't consider myself a nonfiction writer. I consider myself a fiction writer. But I have written nonfiction because life happens to me. And I have written those things because things happen in my life. But I think my nonfiction is written to make space for my fiction. So I wrote this book so that I can write those New Yorker stories. So that's how I look at it. And never say never, right? And nothing is, one thing I really do talk to my students, I think, I notice the the younger generation, sometimes they can be in despair. Yeah, and it's I'm sure you have faced the same, the younger generation, where's hope for them, right? How do they stay enchanted, or are they ever enchanted by life? So I always quote that Rilke's line, no feeling is final, just keep going. And I think for myself, I always go back to that line. No feeling is final, just keep going. That's all we can do. And I think that's all everyone has, yeah.
We are so grateful for having Yiyun Li with us. Thank you for your really probing and excellent questions, and I really hope you'll be back next week. Thank you.